Hello, world. Welcome back to Outside the Valley, the podcast by Art. I'm your host, as usual, Jovian Gautama. For this week's episode, we have a special one. This is a replay of our live AMS session with Ben Orenstein, the co-founder and CEO of Tuple. It was a very interesting session. We covered a lot of grounds, including the benefits of pair programming in remote teams, best practices in pairing, the ups and downs of running a bootstrapped startup, and more. You can also find the simplified version of the transcript on our blog at arc.dev/blog. You can also find the links and resources mentioned on the show notes and, of course, the blog post. Now, without further ado, here we go, Ben Orenstein. And we are live. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jovian, I'm your host for today, and welcome to ARC's live webinar with Tuple, the best remote pair programming app on Mac OS that is also used by companies like Shopify, Basecamp, TaskRabbit, Intercom, and more. Super excited to be joined by Ben Orenstein, the CEO and co-founder of Tuple. Ben, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Super excited to have you here. In this webinar, we're going to talk about how pair programming can level up your remote engineering team, actionable advice from Ben for engineering managers and engineers of teams who are already doing pair programming or looking to start adopting pairing into your product development workflow. And we'll also chat a bit about Ben's and Tuple's startup journeys so far. Before we start, we just want to say we hope everybody is staying safe. We know some of you are under quarantine, and hopefully this event will brighten up your day a bit. So here's how it goes. So we have prepared some questions for Ben, and this is also live AMA, by the way. So if you have any questions for Ben, ask away on the chat box, and we'll get into it. So without further ado, let's get rolling. So Ben, again, great to have you here today. So to kick things off, can you please share a bit about your background and how Tuple came about?
Sure. My background is programming, basically. So I think I've been writing code professionally for something like 12 years now. I studied computer science in college. I was not a good student. So I actually had a wandering career path after school. I did not graduate. So it took me a little while to break my way into the tech field. But eventually I did and got to start writing code for money, which at the time felt like ridiculous to me. I felt like I was cheating. I was like, I get paid to do this? This is way too fun. But so yeah, I've been writing code for a while now. The last good chunk of time has been mostly Ruby, writing Rails apps. And about 2 years ago, I quit my job and along with two co-founders started Tuple, which is a remote pair programming app. And we did it because we didn't find any solutions out there for remote pairing that we liked. We had tried a bunch of options out there. And I just kept noticing that I would ask friends, hey, what are you using for this? And there was not a great answer. And so it felt like, hey, maybe if we focus on this particular use case, we can make something that developers will like better than like more generic screen sharing solutions.
Yeah, I love the story, how you are a Ruby on Rails developer and get a shout out from David Heinemeier Hansen himself, the inventor of Rails using the product. That must be like an awesome feeling.
It was amazing.
Yeah. So yeah. Diving a bit into the pair programming, right? Now, as we know, a lot of people are going remote now, even though it's the unfortunate condition of the pandemic. But we are also like seeing the rise of distributed teams in this couple of years. Do you see pair programming as even more important in remote teams?
Yeah, I would say it's probably more important. So there's a lot of benefits to pairing. But one of them that I think is particularly useful if you are a remote team is that it's less lonely. So there are times where it's fun to just like work by yourself and get really in the zone and crank out some code. And I still love that. But if you're full-time remote or distributed, it can get a little bit lonely. So it's nice to be able to pull somebody in and write some code. And I think humans are pretty social by nature, and we like collaborating on things. And so it can take a task which maybe it's not, or maybe it's hard, right? Like maybe you're about to work on a piece of the app that you know is terrible to work on, or you're super unfamiliar. And often it's just really nice to be able to add another human to that.
Got it. So based on your experience, probably, when you're talking to your customers And in what ways have you seen pair programming has helped teams, on every level, either they're on early stage startups or even like 100 or 1,000 people companies? In how can pair programming help these companies?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of three benefits to the pair programming stool. So one is what I just touched on, just socially. I think it's nice.
Absolutely,
makes it kind of more fun, helps people feel more connected. The other is that it helps with sharing knowledge around the team. So there's knowledge of the application, and I think most good companies want to spread that around so you don't have a single point of failure. Like how do the various pieces work? That happens very naturally as you pair on things, but also like knowledge of the meta stuff around programming. So I don't think I've ever paired with someone and not learned something about how they write code, like an interesting Mac OS tip, or something cool they did with Git that I didn't know you could do, or some new Ruby method I had not seen before. So spreading that kind of just programming skill stuff around, along with the application knowledge. And then finally, I think the code that you get when two people are writing it together is higher quality, which helps you keep shipping quickly as time goes on.
Got it. So I think for next question, I think you have more insights into this. Like, why do you think the practice of pair programming has not yet been adopted more widely in the industry? What's the obstacle there? Is there any potential, like some engineering managers probably there's some engineering managers in the audience, they hesitate in implementing this pair programming process because it's a brand new workflow. What do you think what are the obstacles, like what are the hurdles, or even like the block?
I think a major one is that there's a very easy to make argument against it, which also I think happens to be wrong, but it seems so logical on its face, which is, so you're telling me I'm going to have two programmers write the same code. Doesn't that mean I'm going to get half as much done? And the fact that is such an easy, quick argument to make and seems like it's right, I think is probably like the biggest marketing problem that pair programming has, or definitely one of them. And the problem with that argument to me is that it sort of assumes that the way you value the output of programmers is code. And I actually think that's the wrong mental model. So
absolutely,
every time you sit down to write code, I think you're producing an asset and you're producing a liability. And the asset is problems solved for customers that they will pay you money for. And the liability is the code that's required to make that happen. So if I can make $1 million a month off 100 lines of code, clearly that's better than making the same amount of money off 1 million lines of code, right?
Absolutely.
So if you agree with that, I think you have to kind of accept the premise that code is actually the cost that we pay in order to solve the problems for the customers. So
got it.
Saying, won't two programmers together write half as much code when pairing? And the answer is like, hopefully they'll write even less.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the biggest thing. But there's more. There's other things. I'll respond to a couple other things. So I think another marketing problem that pairing has is that people assume it's some mystical, difficult, weird practice. And like they're either into it or they're not. And it's like religion, and you have to like kind of accept the pairing religion or you have to reject the pairing religion. And in reality, I think more programmers have paired than they think, because if you've ever said, "Hey Jovian, can you look at this bug with me real quick? I know you wrote the user parser. Would you mind just taking a look at this?" And then you like look at it together, boom, pair programming. You're doing it right there. It's just programmers working together on code. There's no special rules about who's typing, who's mousing, whose turn it is, how to switch. Like you can decide all of that for yourself, depending on what works for you and what you like and the people that are involved. And that's pair programming. If there's a pair of you or more, great, you're pairing.
Right. I love it what you say about the measuring the output of a programmer based on the lines of code. I think Bill Gates says something about this. Like using the lines of code as a measurement is like, what's the quote? Basically like measuring an airplane performance based on its weight. Like it doesn't make sense. And yeah, so I think it's also, in my opinion, I think it's also a way, like you mentioned, like pair programming is kind of hard to market, especially in the bigger companies, enterprises, where you're dealing potentially with non-technical executives. So it's probably one of the obstacles that people are still, or engineering managers still need to buy. Again, every job is a sales job as you go up. So,
Sure.
Right.
I do think that
Hmm.
I think the idea of you needing to sell pairing to your management is sort of the wrong way of thinking about it. Like,
Hmm.
you probably wouldn't go and be like, we need to get permission from management to see if I can pull someone over to my desk when I have a question. Right? That no one
Right.
would think that was rational and reasonable. And so I think this idea, like, hold on, time out, we need to get permission to pair programming to pair programming is just, if you, I feel like if you work in an organization that's micromanaging you at that level, the problem is the organization is not pair programming.
Right. Right. That makes sense. So like you mentioned, like it's program is actually, it's not like the mystical thing that is really hard to implement. If you can start and you can just start tomorrow, it makes sense. So what advice do you have for teams who have not implemented the process but they're looking to start tomorrow? What are the actionable steps that they can do, like assuming they already have the green light and they just can do it? What's the first one? First one is download Tuple, I guess. Install Tuple.
I mean, sure. Tuple helps you if you're remote. It's a nice way to do it when you're remote. But if you're in person, I mean, probably not in person now. But if you're in person, you can sit. When you're in person, you can sit down at the same desk. When I would pair at my last job, I would often bring my own keyboard and plug that in because it's nice to have. It's nice to just be able to type when you want. But again, I think it's useful to not think of this as like a big deal. Like, okay, here we go. We're gonna try pairing. It's like, all right, how about you just sit down for 5 minutes with someone who wrote the code you're about to change and say, can you just walk me through this real quick? And then they walk you through it and you say, okay, so I'm thinking about changing here and here. And they go, yep. You're like, great. And then they leave and okay, you just paired. That's great. Congrats. It's no big deal. It's okay. It doesn't have to be scary. So I think, yeah, I mean, start small if it intimidates you.
Right.
Realize that, so I will admit, the challenge of pairing, I think, is actually around the communication and the fact that you now have two humans trying to communicate with each other. And that is always challenging, right? That's always fraught. It's easy to misunderstand each other. It's easy to have different communication styles. It's easy to accidentally offend someone. And that's just true any time that people are communicating. So recognize that the burden for brain cycles spent on communicating and making sure someone understands you is higher. That's sort of the cost of pairing there. But beyond that, maybe just don't worry about it too much. Just try it and see how it goes.
Got it. Yeah. So I'm seeing like some pair program questions are rolling in here. So for the audience, we'll answer some of those later. And some of the questions are things that Ben already touched on, and we'll get back to it later. I want to switch gears a little bit here since it's more about the journey of Tuple itself. How big is Tuple right now?
So we have, I have two co-founders, and the three of us are the only full-time people. And we currently have 3 part-time contractors working, 2 developers and 1 person in sales.
Got it. So now that I believe that you guys are growing, so now as the CEO and co-founder, are there any particular things that you have started to think about now that you are hiring more, remote team members? Have you started thinking about, how to document stuff in a communication? Yeah, just curious what's your approach to this.
Yeah, we definitely are thinking about that a lot. Like a lot of companies right now, we're figuring out how to do this well. I don't think we do it super well to the point where I would feel like you should do it the way we're doing. I will say that one thing that I'm having success with is trying to be a little bit more deliberate about writing things down in places where they kind of durably last, like in a wiki sort of thing. Right. So I'm taking, particularly as I get questions from the person who's helping us out with sales, I take that question, and then rather than answer the question wherever it would happen, I say, I updated this Notion page with, on that topic. And this way, training future people becomes easier. There's a place to check if you need it later. Writing it down has probably the biggest meta habit, I think, that I've seen benefit from. Yeah,
I think writing it down, writing the documentation culture has to come from the top up, because I feel like it's not natural for humans to just write down stuff. It's easier to just chat or just go into a quick Zoom meeting and whatnot. So yeah, great approach you have there. Another thing that I want to talk about is about how do you approach hiring in general. I feel like as a CEO, I've heard a lot of CEOs, even our own CEOs, say that the hiring is probably the hardest job for founders. So how are you approaching this in general, or any tips for other hiring managers or CEOs out there?
I've hired 3/4 of one full-time person so far. And so I don't think I have a lot of great stuff to share there yet. I will point to a different resource, actually, that I think is good, which is there's this thing called the Manager's Handbook from Clearbit. And they
Right.
have a lot of really good detailed info on how to do that. And we're more or less trying to steal their playbook because they're at 100-something people and have thought about this a lot more deeply than we have.
Yeah, I think it's Alex McCow, right?
Alex McCaw, yeah.
So yeah, I just want to have a quick plug here for our company. So if you don't know yet, this webinar is hosted by ARC, a place where you can hire remote software developers all around the world, because actually great talent are most likely not in your zip code. So if you're thinking about building an engineering teams remotely, or just hire a great developer, come to us. We will help you, match you with the great developers all around the world, almost instantly. Well, instant and relatively instant compared to posting jobs out there. So that is a plug. So again, you mentioned about just the deliberately attacking is probably too aggressive word, like just deliberately documenting every stuff, what's happening in your company for future references. Any other best practices, say from pair programming for advice for remote engineering teams to collaborate and communicate better, especially in times like this, or for example, like engineering teams that wasn't remote but now they go remote, other than just write more? Any other advice that they probably can adapt or can implement in terms of communications?
I mean, again, we're still figuring this out ourselves, so I wouldn't point to us as like a shining example. But I will share a lesson that I learned in a previous life, and I learned it in the context of code reviews, actually, like doing code review, which is that when you move from in-person communication to written communication, it's really easy to accidentally make someone feel like you're attacking them. Feedback. So I noticed this in PRs where you could accidentally make it seem like you were, as opposed to asking like, hey, why wasn't this method extracted? Someone can read that and say, why wasn't this method extracted, you idiot? Like, how could you think that this belonged here? And it's a weird thing about brains that when we don't have a face and a tone to latch onto and to use to establish a context for what was said, it can often just go negative for some reason. And so something I try to do in code review, but then also just in written communication in general, is to try to like be almost like too smiley, exclamation pointy, emoji friendly, just too affable, I guess, because it's really, really easy to accidentally get mistaken the other direction.
Got it. Yeah, you have to assume a positive intent. Anyway, so cool. So I think we can go to the questions from the audience here and ask Ben anything. So I'm going to pick this interesting one. I'm also curious about this. From Seth Levine. Any insights on initial project planning and brainstorming for remote teams?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have much to share there. I will say that we have read with interest and attempted the shape up process from Basecamp, which I think is a really excellent resource on this. Even if you decide not to use their process, I think there's some interesting truths in that work. And one of the central ones is that there's this work that has to happen before the work can start. And it's very easy for different people to misunderstand what the work is going to be. So the work of understanding what the work is significant and can help prevent a lot of pain. So I've seen this happen at our company where I'll say, or like someone will say, we should make it so users can edit their profile or something. And the person that says that is envisioning something, and the person that hears that is envisioning something else. And the disconnect is not discovered until work has been done, maybe time has been wasted, unfortunate decisions have been made, perhaps. And so the shape up process recommends this explicit shaping step where someone figures out the answers to the questions and then writes a clear, high level, not totally prescriptive, a description of what the work is that needs to be done in order to help make sure everyone really understands, what is this about? What are we trying to do here? What are the goals and what are the non-goals?
Yeah, I think I reread it a couple of times. It's just like, it's fascinating, like how they work. So now a question about pair programming from Mike Kozer, I'm pronouncing it right. So do you have any tips for the different types of pair programming, master novice, novice novice, or master master?
I actually did write a blog post about this, or an article about this on our pairing guide called How to Pair with a Junior Developer. And I think I also wrote the flip of that, the converse of that, like how to pair with someone more experienced than you. I would say the biggest thing if you're pairing with someone less experienced is probably to realize that they're probably a little bit nervous. It's kind of natural for someone, if they're pairing with someone who's got a lot more experience, they're going to be a little bit more timid. They might need a little more time to think through things. And getting back to that communication misunderstandings, it's going to be extra important for you to make it clear you're not frustrated with them, or that they're taking too long, or that it's really easy to just kind of like brusquely shove aside someone who's thinking and like just type out the answer, or make them feel underappreciated or judged or something. So be aware of that. As far as people pairing at the same level, I think that's less of a problem, but still just be aware of that human tendency. Like, it's just, you're going to have to devote more brain cycles than normal to making sure you're communicating well and establishing a good rapport with the person you're pairing with, regardless of what your relative skill levels are.
Right. Awesome. So next question will be commenter be using Tuple instead of Zoom. We'll see, because I think the commenter team are actually seriously considering like Tuple. By the way, let me just put another plug here. The team behind ARC is also a team behind CodeMentor, the 101 mentorship platform for software developers. So you can basically find a mentor either to do code review, or just when you're stuck in some particular bugs or want to refactor your code, you can just find a mentor and go for a live session, and you can just pay as you go in the hourly rate. So yeah, plugins. Let's continue with this. So 2 questions here that I feel like we can answer together. The first one is from Ting. What are communication best practice while pairing, which is something that you kind of touched on just now? And when does pair programming becoming inefficient or less productive? Not learning, just arguing. Basically, the flip side, like the bad side of the ugly things that can happen in pair programming. So, have you ever had this experience, or even heard about the stories? Well, pair programming just don't work.
Yeah, I think probably the failure mode you're most likely to accidentally fall into is one person programming and one person watching. So especially if you have a skill mismatch. So if you have if the person driving is much more experienced or knows the code that's being edited or written much better, it's possible that you end up in a situation where the junior person is just kind of observing and just acting maybe as a glorified typo checker.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's really not what that's not, at that point, you're not really pairing anymore. You just have an observer that's adding not that much value. And so I tend to recommend, or I think it's usually a pretty good practice, to switch who's driving somewhat regularly, like who actually has hands on the keyboard and the mouse and who's controlling things. And that way it becomes less likely that one person checks out entirely, or is just thinking about something else, or checking their email or something like that.
Got it. So, right. The next question is Ryan. Question is, I'm on a small team, 2 junior devs, 1 senior. We're all working on different problems at the same time. How do you convince management to cut the number of problems the team is working on by 33%? Would you like any thoughts about this? Is this like, I feel like the question is, how do you convince your engineers, your management to, how do you convince your management to cut down, to let them know that you're overworked, something like that?
I think it's a little bit different. I think he's asking, I think I understand the question though, which is this idea that, okay, if we pair on this, we can only have at most two things happening at once, because there's a pair and there's a third person. So I would say start off by don't ask. Like if on Monday you pair with me and on Tuesday I pair with you, then 2 people working together should go much faster than 1 person working alone. So there's this idea that if you take 2 programmers and put them on one problem, you're getting sort of half as much done because they're working at the same speed they did before. But that's definitely not true in my experience. It's really, really hard to block 2 people. And that, I think, is one of the big things that slows down development, is where you get stuck and you don't know what's going on. You're like, this should totally work. I'm completely mystified as to how this is not working. And you spend time here Googling, poking, debugging, and you don't know what's going on. It's way harder. It's more than twice as hard, I think, to block 2 people. And so what I find is when I'm pairing, progress usually just kind of happens pretty continuously. It's like almost like a linear progress towards the goal. Versus when I'm pairing alone, I'll get really, I'll make a lot of progress and then get stuck, and then make a little progress and then get stuck. And so you may just find if you don't ask for permission and just say, hey, why don't you pair with me for an hour today and I'll pair with you for an hour tomorrow, you may actually find that you're getting even more done than before because people have different sets of knowledge. That's why I think it's harder to get blocked.
Right.
There's two sets of eyes, so it's easier to spot typos or silly mistakes. When someone is navigating as opposed to driving, they can be looking at documentation or spotting. It's easier to spot problems and bugs when you're not actually typing the code. But then also people just have disparate knowledge. So it may just be that I understand this subsystem or this API a lot better than you do. And so when an error happens, I can just get us unstuck right away.
Got it. Cool. We have even more questions here. Cool. And one, so got it. So right.
I want to phrase.
So
I have an answer. I just want to phrase this. This just kind of occurred to me for a second. You probably wouldn't ask. You almost certainly would not ask your manager for permission to use a new text editor, right? So, think of it as a tool in your tool belt. Don't think of it as a religion you need to adopt or a crazy practice that needs to be spread around your team. Think of it like this is a thing I reach for when it makes sense to me and when I find it useful and in the amount that seems useful to me. And so think of it less as a thing you would ask for permission for and just more a practice you might occasionally have that could be useful.
Got it. Awesome. So another one is by Michael. Michael asks, you've mentioned the social nature and sharing of knowledge as a positive aspects of pair programming. What are some obstacles to look out for that might be getting in the way? So not really sure.
Socially?
Challenges probably, yeah. Probably. I think we've already touched a bit this, but the social challenges. But Ben, if you want to expand on that, do you want to?
I mean, I think it's all the same problems of human communication that you're used to, which is that it's easy to be misunderstood. It's easy to possibly offend somebody. If someone's sitting next to you, maybe you need to take a shower more often than you would otherwise, or something. Like there's all these different human concerns that happen all of a sudden when you combine forces as opposed to working separately. And so I'm not sure there's that much there that is programming specific. So if you're doing your communication best practices in the world, and it can be really good. By the way, one way to help address these things, if you work with people that are willing to give you feedback, is ask for it. So at the end of a pairing session, a really good habit to get into is like, how did that go? Like what were a couple good things and what were a couple things that we could do better next time? And just try to solicit feedback explicitly and make that part of your process. And then, because there are some skills to be learned here. And so, to some extent, I think pairing is overcomplicated or sort of has a reputation of overcomplication. But there are some things to learn that are more challenging than working alone. So asking for feedback or giving two-way feedback at the end of a session is probably a really good habit to get into.
Yeah, awesome. So by the way, again, for the audience, I think there are some overlapping questions here. And so this webinar will be also repackaged as a podcast episode. ARC also have a podcast called Outside the Valley, hosted by me. We talk about remote startup leaders and remote work advocates of distributed teams. So you can find it there. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, and we'll let you know when it's published. Okay, get back to the questions. Question from Paul. What lessons did you learn from your previous projects that you applied to Tuple as co-founder?
I mean, I don't know. Probably hundreds of them. It'd be hard to really tease it apart. Like I think part of the reason Tuple has gone well is that I launched lots of smaller SaaSes and products before this. So Tuple is not the first time I tried to charge money to people on the internet. I have done this in a bunch. I've launched a couple small SaaSes and then a couple one-off purchase products before this, or actually a few of them, maybe three. So each time I think I got a little bit better and I learned a little bit more about it. Kind of too many lessons to summarize there, but I guess the sort of bigger lesson there is if you do one day want to start a software company, start other things now, because SaaS is actually kind of the hardest business to grow, I think, probably. It's hard to charge people, get people to sign up for subscriptions. That's challenging.
Yeah.
It's hard to build the right thing code-wise. That's also hard. So think of SaaS kind of as running, and think of trying to get like $5 from someone on the internet for something you made as like walking. Like what could you do that looks like that? Start there. Start like ebook kind of thing.
Got it. All right. Next question from Ryan again. What are the biggest mistakes you've made as a founder and as a manager? I think you've touched a bit on the founder side, but I wonder if you have anything on the manager side, since you're growing.
TBD kind of. Like I think my bigger mistakes are probably in front of me. But I will say, and this is something I touched on, is that not almost every time I think I and my co-founders agree on what's about to get built and how it will work and what it will look like, but we don't write it down, there's a mismatch there. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little. But basically every time I think, okay, this feature is so small, we don't need to write anything up. This is fine. Like you definitely understand what we're thinking. And then sometimes it'll be like, wow, we still were talking past each other. So I've been surprised by the necessity for that to avoid, unfortunate like wasted time or code that needs to be rewritten.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it happened to us a couple of times. Or even me, like I'm a developer, but sometimes you go to a marketing campaign with designers and whatnot, like, wait, this is not what I had in mind. And then you have to recalibrate again. Next is from Robin. Now, this is an interesting one. What is the product roadmap of Tuple? Could you share some new features we'll see in the near future?
Maybe. So I've been burned by this a little bit before about talking about stuff that we're going to do because we are a startup. And so a lot of the times the landscape changes out from under us. And so I think like we're going to do X, Y, Z, and then something happens. Like, as you can imagine, like the last month has completely upended the things that we thought were top priorities versus not. So I will sort of say that in the long term, we're interested in pushing the state of the art of remote pair programming forward. So we now have really high quality screen share, an efficient application that doesn't burn your CPU, high quality audio, good latency. We've sort of gotten the basics that we wanted to get in place. Like you can use it as a pairing app and it works well for that. And a lot of our customers find that it works better than other generic tools. So the initial sort of idea, like could we make a business based on this idea, has been validated, it's working. Now it's like, to me, the interesting thing is, what are the unsolved problems in doing pair programming remotely that no one has solved? That maybe people don't even really realize is a problem, or that the world has never seen a good solution to. And so that's where my head is over the next handful of months and quarters. And we've been doing some interesting explorations there, and I think we have some good stuff in the pipeline that people will go, oh, nice! Like this is a pain point I had that I've never seen anyone solve before. And that to me is like our greater mission. So that's kind of the big post. The other is that we're Mac OS only right now, and it's a shame that you can't pair with people on Linux or Windows. And so long term, I think it's highly likely that we end up moving towards those platforms as well.
Awesome. Right. So another question, I'll go with Chris first. How do you deal with different editor preferences, either different shortcuts or entirely different IDEs, editors? When you switch driver/navigator, do you switch to a driver's machine?
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of a good way to do it. Is like if I drove for 40 minutes and then we'll take a break, and then maybe you drive for 40 minutes, but let's just put it on your machine. I'll push my changes, you pull them down. I'm a big believer in customizing the crap out of your setup. Like my vimRC is probably 1,000 lines long, and I've been working on it for it's like literally a decade old. It's got like changes in there from like 10 years ago. So it would be unreasonable for me to expect that you could just drop in on my setup and feel very comfortable. And it would be better if we can each work in our highly customized, super tuned environment, I think. So I like longer driving blocks, followed by a break, followed by swapping machines, ideally.
Interesting. Right. So, by the way, Ben also mentioned that for Tuple, you have like this high quality screen sharing. I think you're being modest. So for people, so when you go to Tuple's website, there is an intro video by Ben himself, and there is this screen sharing mode, which is called ludicrous mode, which is absolutely ludicrous at like 5K. Yeah, actually, I want to ask about that. Like, why did you decide to have this ultra high definition, like 5K? Like, why is it necessary in your opinion?
Because the code is everything. Code is paramount. Like, if you can't read the code, like, useless, right?
Right.
So we prioritize the screen quality above almost everything. Audio is also really high up there. And programmers tend to have giant screens, and they often have tiny fonts. And the difference between like a less than or a greater than or a type and a exclamation point are really important in code. So to me, those pixels are worth everything. And so we basically figured out a way to send way more data and just like have much higher resolution options if you've got the bandwidth for it. We have a resolution switcher. So if you can't support it, you can sort of downgrade a bit. But ideally, it should look like you're on the machine. Like if there's a ton of pixel data there, let's send as much as we can within reason. So you ideally don't even know you're pairing or remotely.
Got it. Cool. Next question by Debbie Chu, which is actually my coworker. Hi, Debbie. So Debbie asked, hi, Ben, what are the biggest future trends you see affecting engineering in the next few years?
Sorry, what was that? The biggest what?
Future trends you see
future
affecting.
trends. Biggest future trends. Well, controversial opinion, but I think remote has perhaps going to get and stay more popular. So like one of the reasons we chose Tuple of the business ideas we had was that we suspected that there would be more and more remote developers every year. There has been a dramatic acceleration in that trend for obvious reasons. I think that trend is here to stay. I think there are lots of people who, having experienced remote work, will want to do it at least part-time in the future. So I think tools and processes and habits for supporting remote work are basically permanent now. These are going to be this is like just a brand new concern that I think will always kind of be there.
Yeah, absolutely. I concur that I think we do really think that remote work is here to stay. Another question by Ryan again, and this is an interesting one. Question is, tips for pair programming across a language barrier? My team is in Germany and Lithuania. Everyone speaks English, but accents get confusing, and the founder really struggles to communicate in English sometimes. So I wonder if there's like there's any hybrid way to do this, like half writing and half audio. I wonder what your take on this.
I don't know. I actually haven't dealt with this particular problem. I would say, hopefully you're using some tool that lets you have remote control, because sometimes I find, even among native speakers of the same language, you end up dictating the code you want them to write, which is like just an anti-pattern I think you should steer away from when pairing. Like if you're saying like less than or equals this thing, like capital A, then like it's just better to just grab the keyboard for a second. Like hopefully you have remote control. Like let me show you what I mean. It's like tap 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 tap, and then it's a lot clearer. So that might be a good option for this. Like if you're having trouble being understood, have that other person grab control for a second and write the code they're thinking of.
I feel like it's also the matter of fidelity. Like for example, I know in Tuple you also have like the whiteboarding option where you can do stuff. Am I correct?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. So I think there's also like Sorry.
Well, yeah, we have basically a drawing feature, so you can paint on the other person's screen. So sometimes like a little diagram is like the clearest way to explain like what's going on.
Yeah, so I feel like it's like just another channel or like where to increase the fidelity in communication, especially when you have a language barrier, which is absolutely interesting. Another question again from Mike Koser. If you pair program continuously, do you feel there is still value in code reviews? This is a good one.
Yeah, I like that question. I think you're pretty justified to skip a code review if you've paired on a feature. And I think this is one of those lesser known benefits of pair programming. Like if you've had, so let's compare after the fact code review with pairing for a second. So if your team has bought, and this by the way, if you are in this place where you have to make the argument for pairing, this might help you. If you are on a team that has already been sold on the value of code review, which hopefully is a lot of them, you have someone write the code, and then someone else has to come in after the fact and try to review the code. The problem is it's really hard to do good code review. It is it's an interruption in your day. If you don't do it quickly, the person who wrote the code is blocked. So you're holding up this feature from shipping. And it's hard to do well in the best circumstances, but it's particularly challenging because the thing you're seeing at the end is a finished artifact. It is the end result of problems that person ran into along the way and decisions they made and ways they solved it. And a lot of that is not there in the final diff. So sometimes a code review is like, is there a reason you didn't use this thing? And they go, yes, I tried that because X, Y, Z. Like, oh, but could you maybe do this? Oh, no, yeah, I tried that too, and this didn't work. And a lot of the context has to be reconstructed after the fact, or the code review suffers. And like if I hand you 1,000-line diff, you can maybe give me a good code review, but it's going to be hard, right? Like it's too much. It's overwhelming. It's going to take me 45 minutes to load all the context into my head and understand what it used to look like, how it works now. Is this a good thing? Are we doing what we said we wanted to do? It's just super challenging. Versus if I wrote this code with you, then all of that context, all the decisions I made along the way are automatically reviewed by two people. So there's like basically a continuous review happening. And you have that subtle pressure of there's someone else writing this code with me. I should do it the right way. Like I think there's less tendency of, so let's say you take a kind of ugly shortcut while you're writing code separately. And then I see it in the PR and I'm like, he really shouldn't have done it this way, but like, I don't really want to go make him rewrite this.
Got it.
Right?
Yes.
Like there's this, you shouldn't have done it. I don't really want you to have done it, but like between the two of us, it's going to be hard it's hard socially for me to ask you to go rewrite it. I feel bad. But if we're doing it together, when we reach that decision point, like, oh, should I take the hacky thing or should I do it? Maybe you have a conversation and you say, what do you feel about the shortcut? And you go, why don't we let's try it the other way for 5 minutes and see if we can get it. And then maybe you end up with a better product after that.
Right. Right. It seems like pair programming is like one of the rare, I'm not sure if it's rare or not, but it's one of those cases where synchronous work in remote teams is actually way better compared to asynchronous. Like you mentioned, right? If you do code review, there's so much context that you have to front load like the whole thing, and you have to go think about it sometimes you have to guess what's the context in this yourself. And the other option is you chat this person, hey, what do we, and that's another interruption of their time, right? Yeah. So yeah, and I think it's interesting.
I feel like I think most programmers really enjoy writing code, and I think I would imagine that most programmers don't enjoy reviewing code nearly as much. Like I think of doing code reviews as kind of like a necessary chore.
Interesting, yeah.
So if you can swap a code review habit after the fact with a pairing habit, you're trading code review for more coding, which to me, as a programmer, sounds more fun.
Got it. Cool. Moving on to the next question. Chris, how does Tuple handle different keyboard layouts? I've had a lot of problems with other tools when my partner remotes into my machine and has a different keyboard layout.
This was like a month of work last year, and then occasional fix-ups along the way. We started and we only supported like US ASCII support, and then we added like international support and different layouts and all that. So I didn't actually write this code, so I don't actually know how it works under the hood, but I do know that we have people using different languages, different layouts. I actually use the Dvorak keyboard layout, so I'm not a QWERTY user, and I can pair just fine with people on using QWERTY. So there's basically a mapping layer that we do before we send the keystrokes over to figure out how we should model this thing as on the other side. So it works is the answer.
Got it. So another question, I think from Seth Levine, I think it's a follow-up from the code review code review and pair programming question. Seth asked, but how do you address insights after the code is written? Isn't there a different perspective after code is written that an unbiased third party could see?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, if you want to bring a third person in to review the code after two people have written it, yeah, you're definitely going to end up with some insights and maybe better code as well. But keep in mind now you're investing three people's time in the same bit of code. So if you would you write code by yourself and then have two people review it? Maybe, sure. Yeah, that could be worth it depending on, the calculus of your business and how bad an error is and how important it is the code be high quality and all these factors.
Yeah.
So
Ryan,
I think if a pair wrote the code, I would tend to say don't add a third person as a code reviewer unless you think it's worth it. Like, is this billing code? Is it particularly sensitive to errors? Maybe bring an extra set of eyes in there.
Got it. Another question from Chris. How do you feel about mechanical refactoring commits, such as extract method, etc.? I tend to make lots of tiny commits like that. Helps with the review because you have many small diffs instead of one huge commit.
I don't tend to like to look at individual commits during review. I would rather see personally, I mean, I tend to just look at the unified diff. I guess you could pull it out into commit by commit and see that. Maybe that's a good thing for your reviewers to use. I could see it. It does kind of help address the whole, like, here's a giant change, I don't know how to like parse it out, versus here's a commit that changes something small, here's another commit that changes something small. That's kind of nice. One thing that I do, so I guess my answer to that is that seems reasonable. If it works for your reviewers and you, that seems like a totally legitimate way to go about it. One thing that I do like as a sort of tactic is the pre refactoring commit or PR. Mm-hmm. So sometimes if I'm about to make a change to some code, I'll say, oh, you know, this would be really easy if instead of this stuff being duplicated in 3 places, we had extracted a whatever, and there were only one place to change this. And so I'll actually do that refactoring and open it as a new PR just for the refactoring, like no behavior change, just refactor. And then I'll start a branch off that PR or off that branch that actually implements my new changes. And so like the PR, the refactoring PR can get reviewed and merged, and then my code can get reviewed and merged. And one great thing that falls out of that habit is that sometimes you'll do the refactoring, and then in the interim, priorities change, or you decide not to do the new change to that code, but you've shipped like a nice refactoring that hopefully has tidied things up and made it easier to change in the future.
Got it. Another question here again from Ryan. In your own experience, can you handle as many hours of pair programming in one day as you are solo programming? Great
question. Definitely not. It is much more draining to pair program than to program alone, and it's like living with someone versus living by yourself or something. You now have this overhead, right, of another human, and right. So you have more brain work to do. You have to think about where they're at and read their emotions and understand the communication between the two of you. And pairing definitely necessitates a higher level of communication. So that's more draining. And also, you're probably going to work harder, actually. If you block off 2 hours to pair with someone, you are not flipping over to your email. You're not jumping on Slack. You're not jumping on Twitter. You're probably just working, except for explicit breaks, for most of that time. And so it's a bit more draining to just work harder. But I do think that's one of the things that falls out of pairing is like it becomes socially a little uncomfortable to just like hop over to Twitter as soon as you get blocked by something, or while you're waiting for something to build or tests to run or something like that. So I would plan, if you're newer to pairing, plan short sessions, maybe shorter than you would guess, and also just realize like 4 hours of pairing in a day is probably more draining than 8 hours of programming by yourself.
Right. Awesome. So I'm scrolling up. I think missing some questions. Another question by Ryan again. So for Tuple, are you targeting one type of developer over another? For example, web versus game dev, and how does that affect your feature map?
No, we're pretty agnostic on what kind of programming you do because we share the whole desktop and with the remote control. So it doesn't matter if you have a terminal or if you have it doesn't matter what editor you're using, what tools you're using. Are you in the browser? Are you in the terminal? Are you using Sketch? We're agnostic as to what's on the screen and how you're using it. So we optimize for things that technical people tend to care about, programmers in particular. But beyond that, we don't say like, oh, this is better for web devs or something.
Got it. Awesome. So what else here? Chris mentioned that I find remote pair programming more draining than in-person pairing. I think it's, yeah, I can see that. Like in-person pairing, you can, let's just take a break and talk about this code while, getting coffee or something like that. But remote, it's you versus your partner in a sense. Another question. Yeah, sorry.
Nope. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think probably schedule more frequent breaks for remote pairing.
Absolutely. From Glenn Allen here. So I'm scrolling up. So Glenn asked about, the pair programming concept isn't new, as we kind of know. Some years back, it was called extreme programming. I remember it's like, I think it's Pivotal, someone invented this or launched this term, but it did not catch on. I think Glenn asked, did you had a research on this and learn from that particular history?
I read a pairing book or two that was written by people that were kind of around during that era, like when extreme programming stuff, but not that much. There's probably some stuff I could learn there, and I'm open to links, resources.
Got it.
We do have a pair programming guide, and we link out to external resources. So it's actually learntopair.com, And if you have stuff to add to it, there's a little feedback box there. And if you send me something great, I will add it to the site because I want this to be a really good resource for people to do pairing of any kind.
Got it. Awesome. Another question from Paul. Saw a Shopify engineer on a website that is a customer. Any interesting case study you can share? Probably from Shopify or even some of your other customers, I think is fine.
Case studies. No, I do this is sort of on my list of things to do for the company is like actually write up a experience report. I can share one data point, which is that we surveyed our customers at one point and we said, do you think that adopting Tuple increased the amount of pairing you did? And 71% of them said yes. So in the aggregate, it does seem like we're like effectively increasing the amount of pairing. So if you buy the argument that pairing is good and more is better, then it seems like as a group, it's kind of working.
Got it. Another question by Chris. Now, this is an interesting question. I'm not sure if it's the case. So Chris asked, any experience pairing with non-devs? Is that even a thing, actually? This is
pair with non-devs. So I've paired with designers before, which actually was a really cool experience. So like combining writing the back-end code with also like doing some of the front-end work. But it's been pretty rare. I can only think I've done that like maybe 2 or 3 times. Also occasionally doing like a screen share, not really pairing anymore, but just showing something to a stakeholder is totally, a normal part of the process where it's like, hey, this is what we have so far. Does this look right to you? Not quite pairing, but same idea.
Right. Cool. Another question by Seth. Any tips on pairing data scientists with software engineers? Different skill set, but working on deploying an ML model.
Yeah, no specific experience there. I suspect most of what I've said would apply. But then if you learn some awesome data science programmer collaboration specific things, let me know. Write a blog post. Tell the world.
Right. Awesome. Let me scroll up again. I don't think, let me see if there are any more questions. Let me see. I think we have I think we covered everything here, especially the product roadmap, and cool. And so I think this is a good point to end our AMA, our live webinar today. Ben, so where can people learn more about your journey and Tuple and what's next for the company?
The best answer to that is probably my podcast. So I host a more or less weekly podcast, and I talk about what's going on in the company and what our thoughts are week to week. So if you're interested in the nitty gritty of like running a software company, that's probably the best bet. And that is at artofproductpodcast.com. The podcast is called The Art of Product.
Let me just throw the link here to the chat. Yeah, so for people out there, I also recommend to listen to Ben's previous talk, either podcasts. Ben was also a speaker on several developer conference like RailsConf. It's all super interesting. And again, for this webinar will be repackaged into the podcast of our podcast in Outside the Valley. So you can catch up there again and re-listen if you're missing any details on what Ben said today. So again, Ben, thank you so much for your time today. We really learned a lot. And yeah.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. So thank you, everyone. If you do have any question, if you need anything I can help, you can just find me on Twitter or follow arc.dev on Twitter. And cool. Again, Ben, thank you so much.
My pleasure. And by the way, if people have additional questions I didn't get to here, I'm R00K on Twitter, and I'm happy to respond there.
Yeah. By the way, for all the resources and all the resources that we mentioned here on the chat will be put on the podcast show notes on our blog. So look for it. Okay, cool. Again, Ben, thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.
And that's it for another episode of Outside the Valley, brought to you by Arc. We created this podcast with the hope that in each episode, you can learn something new from other remote startup people. So if you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at jovian@arc.dev. It's jovian@arc.dev. Or you can find us on Twitter at arc.dev. See you next week with another episode of Outside the Valley, and ciao.